All right. We're in Matthew 25 this morning. If you would turn there. We're winding down our series on the parables of Jesus, and we're looking at the parables in Matthew chapter 25. And we come to the parable of the talents. At least that's what it's called. I guess if I were to give it a name, it would be 2 heroes and a 0. And you'll see why I call it that here in a minute. But the setting of this parable is exactly the same as the trilogy of parables that we looked at last week. If you'll remember, this is where we are in the ministry of Jesus at the very end of his public teaching. He's on the Mount of Olives. He's teaching about his second coming, what it's going to be like before his coming, and then he's really telling us that there's going to be a delay. And we saw that in that trilogy of parables. There's going to be a delay. The emphasis of those parables and this parable is really somewhat on the delay between Jesus' first coming, in which he inaugurated his kingdom, and then his second coming, which will be the consummation of his kingdom when he comes to rule and to reign as King of Kings and Lord of Lords on a restored earth, right? So there's a delay, though, and that's the thing. During the interim, what are we to do? And last week we saw it. We're to watch. We're to be on the alert. We're to be prepared. We're to act wisely. We're to serve others in the context of the body. We looked at that. Be prepared, like the wise maidens, the 5 wise virgins who had the oil, right? They had the Holy Spirit. They were prepared for the coming of the Lord. But we serve an absentee Lord, and his absence has been longer than the early church and even the contemporary church has even ever thought of. I mean, here we are nearly marking 2,000 years since he ascended back into heaven after those 40 days of ministry with the disciples after his resurrection. So it's been a long time. And so the setting of this parable is near the end of Jesus' public teaching, his final public teaching, and it's about what his followers are to do during the delay, during the interim between his first coming and his coming again. So let's look at it. Matthew chapter 25. We're going to look at verses 14 down to 30. So let's read there. Danny, if you don't mind, if you'd kick us off. Thank you.
For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country, who called his own servant and delivered his goods to them.
To one he gave 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, each according to his ability.
Then he that had received the 5 talents went and traded with the same, and made them other 5 talents.
And likewise he that had received 2, he also gained another 2.
But he that had received 1 went and digged in the earth and hid his Lord's money.
And after a time, the Lord of those servants cometh and reckoneth with them.
And so he that had received 5 talents came and brought other 5 talents, saying, Lord, thou deliverest unto me 5 talents. Behold, I have gained beside them 5 talents more.
The Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord.
He also, who had received 2 talents, came and said, Lord, you delivered to me 2 talents. Look, I have gained 2 more talents besides them.
The Lord said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord.
Then the man who had received the Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed.
And I was afraid, and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there, you have what is yours.
But his Lord answered and said to him, You wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I have not scattered seed.
So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own with interest.
Therefore, take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents.
For to every everyone who has more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away.
And now that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Whew, another one of those scary parables at the end, right? Well, if I were to ask the point of this parable, the talents, people have pretty much made up their mind across the years what it is. I mean, it's so familiar, so much a part of our Christian education, upbringing, and heritage that the question almost seems silly. The answer, obvious, that, Jesus gives us talents. I know it's the same word as what's in here, but that's not the word in here. The word in here is an amount of money. Obviously, when you read the parable from the context, you get that. But then people make the application that the Lord gives every one of us talents, abilities, and various ones. I mean, we don't all get the same thing. You see a difference here. There's 5, and there's 2, and there's 1. So, some people are 5 talent people, and some people are 2 talent people, some people are 1 talent people, but everybody's got some ability that the Lord gives us, and certainly with spiritual gifts, He does give everybody at least one spiritual gift, if not several, right? And so the real question is, are you faithful in using these talents and abilities that God has given you? And that's usually how this whole deal is played out, and we can just close the book and go home or go on to worship, right? Not so fast. Because I really think that if you look at this parable, that's there. That's a legitimate application. I'm not going to dismiss it. I'm just going to assume it this morning. And I want to build on it and go deeper with you in this parable, because I really believe that there is a much higher purpose that Jesus had in telling this parable. And we're going to get into it as we look at it. Because I believe that this famous parable is really about taking risks to advance the kingdom. That's what it's about. It is about the dismiss it. I'm just saying let's build on that. Okay? That's our foundation. But this thing is really about taking risk. It ultimately raises the kind of Christianity here that is at a deeper level. And that's what Jesus did with these parables. He challenges us. I mean, He calls us out. He calls us to step further than we've ever been before. He calls us to stretch and to reach beyond where we are, right? And that's what this parable does, really. And the question is, from this parable, how willing are we to risk for the sake of Christ and His kingdom? We live in a culture that is completely risk averse, though, don't we? I mean, think about it. My father-in-law is in the insurance business. He's an insurance agent. And I can guarantee you we are double, triple, quadruple covered for pretty much any eventuality that you can think of. A lot of people are underinsured. I am way overinsured, okay? Because he didn't want anything to happen to his little girl back there, and he's made sure that she is taken care of. But you think about it. From the way progress has gone in society, this is an age of anesthetized delivery rooms and homogenized milk. We've got, from tax shelters to bomb shelters, from womb to tomb. We play it safe. I mean, that's our society. That's our culture. That's the way it is. We don't like risk. We want to minimize risk as much as possible. In fact, I was reading about, and this I think started back in the 80s when I was in seminary. There was a cryogenic company. In fact, I looked them up, and they're still out there. Alcor Life Extension. They're out there in California. They will put your body in deep freeze if you've got some terminal illness until they discover a cure for that illness, and they're able to give you that cure as they revive you and bring you back from frozen suspension. Now, I'm not sure how all that works out or whether it even works out. A lot of people have paid a lot of money to put themselves in cryogenic freeze, and the maintenance on that is unbelievable. I looked at the cost and I was like, this is crazy. But that, I guess, is a way to minimize the ultimate risk in life, death. And so we do a lot of playing it safe, don't we? I remember Davy Crockett famously said, make sure you're right, then go ahead. Fess Parker, in his portrayal of Davy Crockett, said, look before you leap. And we say that, don't we? Look before you leap. We do a lot of looking, but we do very little leaping in our Christian life, if you'll think about it. Dr. Frank Farley, he's a former president of the American Psychological Association and the American Educational Research Association. He's former presidents of those. He's a professor at Temple now. He's a Canadian. And he spent 20 years of his life studying people who have what he calls risk-taking personalities. He looked for the T factor. T stands for thrill, if you didn't know. The T factor in people. And he said that those who have this T factor are those who are willing to risk either positively or negatively. That is, willing to risk honestly for the contribution of humanity or self, or willing to risk dishonestly to the detriment of society. That is, living a life of crime. And you see some people seem to have a personality that is more risk-taking than other people. Most of us want to play it safe, right? We just like to watch people taking risks, don't we? That's what we want to do. But it's amazing what people do for thrills. I mean, I was looking at extreme sports, from base jumping to skydiving to windsuiting to bungee jumping to zip lining to hang gliding through the air. And then there's kite surfing and windsurfing and cave diving and cliff jumping and whitewater rafting in the water. And then there's snowboarding and skiing and ice climbing and snowmobiling and snow kiting and snowblading in the snow and ice. And then, of course, there's skateboarding and drifting and caving and slacklining and rock climbing and bouldering and zorbing on the ground. Anybody ever heard of zorbing? You don't know what zorbing is? It is encasing yourself in a plastic bubble and rolling down a hill. That's one of the latest things. It's one of the latest things. Now, when I was a kid, we'd just get in an old garbage can and roll down the hill. I mean, nothing new under the sun. But people like to take risk, and they'll come up with creative ways of doing so to put their lives at risk, right? Now, I like to ride a four-wheeler, and my wife, every time I take that thing out in the back of my truck or on a trailer and I head out the driveway, she is wringing her hands and worried to death because she knows what I like to do when I fire up that four-wheeler. She's seen me, unfortunately. I like to take the toughest, biggest, baddest trails that are out there. I want to take the Black Diamond. I get those guides to tell me where to go to find the craziest trail that's out there. And I want to go on the Black Diamond, There's one place up in Colorado that I went one time, and it goes by the Devil's Punch Bowl. Pretty aptly named place. It's near Independence Pass. It's on the backside of Aspen and the Maroon Bells. And there is a place up there that when you look off the edge, you might as well be looking off the tip of the Empire State Building. It's like 1,200 to 1,500 feet drop right off the edge. And if you look really hard down at the bottom, as you're right on the edge, barely enough room for your four-wheeler wheels to get on to stay on the trail, you can see the carcasses of dead Jeeps and four-wheelers way, 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 way down there at the bottom of sheer cliffs that have fallen down and where people have literally lost their lives because they want to get a thrill. Okay? That's why your dad has that insurance policy on me. Now I got it. Okay. Hey, you ought to be encouraging me to keep going out there, But people do, don't they? They will put themselves at great personal risk just for an adrenaline rush. And there are other kind of rushes that you can get. I mean, not just from physical activity, but I mean, there are a lot of people who invest in the stock market. There are day traders. There are people who put their money in the market and they'll put money on an IPO when stock first comes out and ride that thing and then try to sell it at the top, and they watch those market indicators on their computers all day long. That's what some people, they get a rush out of doing that. There are thousands of people entering the stock market every day. 54% of Americans have some money in the stock market some way, form, or fashion. And, since Trump got elected, y'all have done good if you've got money in there. But there are other kinds of risks, too, where people put money, in the lottery. There are a lot of people who put a little money in and expect to win big, right? I go to Weigel's and I can't even get to the counter to buy my milk, because there are people there buying lottery tickets all the time. And yet, you are more likely to win an Oscar or medal at the Olympics than you are to win the lottery. You are 4 times more likely to get struck by lightning, which we heard a lot of thunder at about 4 o'clock this morning. You're 4 times more likely to get struck by lightning than you are to win that Powerball. So think about that when you go to Weigel's, okay? Just clear path for me. I want to pay for my milk and I want to get out of there. Don't be buying those lottery tickets. But people want to take a risk. But now most people, if you think about it, most people just want to live a lifestyle, and you're committed to a lifestyle of what? Playing it safe. The parable of the talents, I think, has been submitted to so much lameness, tameness, and sameness, it's almost become a story of the bland leading the bland. We already know what this one means, and move on to the next topic, right? God gives you talents, use your talents, or you might lose them. Okay, check. We got that. We can go on. Now, there's a truth in that moral, of course, and it's a legitimate application, as I said. But that is certainly not all Jesus was trying to teach us in this parable. Not at all. There's so much more, just as there is in all the parables, if you'll think about it. Christ's parables are not lame little stories with lame little morals, are they? They're outrageous stories about outrageous characters. And we've looked at them, haven't we, as we've gone along. A shepherd that leaves 99 to go after one. A landowner who sends his son to his death after his servants are all beaten up, right? A man who builds his house on the sand. A vineyard owner that pays everybody the exact same wage no matter how many hours they worked in the day. Crazy stuff, isn't it? It blows your mind when you read these parables, if you'll read them like he told them, without all the stuff we've glommed onto them. They're really quite shocking, aren't they? And the characters are just big and bold, larger than life sometimes. And so what we need to understand from that is that the Christian life should be anything. It should be anything other than predictable and conventional. And so in this parable of the talents, Jesus is not just talking about what we should do with our talents. He's also challenging us. He's saying to follow me is to be willing to live a life of risk. To live a life of risk. And that concept speaks of a life of adventure. It's taking chances. It's laying it all on the line. It's being all in. And we don't normally think about that when we think of the Christian life. We normally think of playing it safe. Am I right? Really. And yet, His kingdom moves forward to the extent that we are willing to take risks. Think about it. It's true, isn't it? Any missionary endeavor you think about, there's a lot of risk involved. Go all the way back to the very first followers that He called to drop their nets or to drop their business or whatever and come and follow Him. That's risk, right? From the very beginning. He wanted everybody to be all in, on the cutting edge, not really knowing what tomorrow's going to look like, but willing to put their faith in Him to the point that they were willing to do whatever it was that He wanted them to do. That is not lame, same, and tame. Okay? It's not playing it safe. Now, to be honest with you, the first, the 5-talent servant and the 2-talent servant in this parable are just essentially window dressing. The real star of this show is the guy who was unwilling to take a risk. The 1-talent man. He took the Lord's money and what? Did nothing. Yeah, he buried it. He just hid it in the ground. Now, make no mistake, even holding 1 talent was a big deal. We talked about the parable of the minas. That was a different category of money, a different amount of money. This is a talent. A gold talent weighs about 33 kilograms of gold. If you look at troy ounces of gold and you start doing the math on that thing, you're going to find out that we're talking about, in today's money, a talent. You know how much that is? $1.4 million. That's a lot of money. So even the 1-talent man had a tremendous responsibility that was handed to him. And you can almost sympathize with the dude just a little bit when you think about that kind of cash. That is a lot of money, okay? So you start doing the math on that deal. 5 times $1.4 million, 2 times $1.4 million, and then $1.4 million. That's today's money. That's how much this master gave. Now back then in New Testament days, it was only worth about $30,000. But that was life-altering in and of itself, because a day labor, you know how much a day laborer made? He made a denarius. Remember we talked about that. You know how much a denarius is worth? $3.62. Guy was handed 30 grand in his money in that day versus $3.62 of what he could make in a day. If he worked 6 days a week, which that's what the Bible says, 6 days a week, 312 days a year, he would amass at the end of that $1,129. Compare that with what he was handed. It would take 25 years for him to make that kind of money. This was life-altering money that these guys were handed. And so, you kind of have a little bit of sympathy with the 1-talent man, because this was a lot of money he was handed here, and he wanted to not take any risks with it. He wanted to play it safe. And yet that's not what his master told him to do. What did the master tell each of these guys to do? Invest this stuff. Invest the money I'm giving you and make more. Right? The way it is in Luke's version, and the King James kind of messes it up when it says, occupy till I come. It just means that it means it's where we get pragmatic from. Put it to work. Invest it. You see at the very end he says, hey, you could have at least put it in the bank, got interest off the stuff. Why are you hiding it in the ground? He was just playing it safe. So, get me to the application of the parable, and you got 3 points here. The first is risk participating in what God is doing rather than observing. This servant did the opposite of that. This servant couldn't bring himself to act at all. He seemed to be paralyzed, immobilized, fossilized by fear of losing it, right? So even though he had less to lose than the other guys, he wouldn't budge. And like so many of us today, he was a typical spectator, bench warmer, observer. He just watched the other guys doing their business, going out there trying to invest, trying to make money with the master's money, and he just watched. He stood on the sidelines, never participating in what his Lord was doing to help advance his kingdom. So what is it about the idea of taking risks that excites us and yet at the same time scares the crap out of us so we don't want to do it when it comes to the kingdom of God? We seem to be in love with the idea of risk as long as somebody else is doing it. Right? Pat loves to watch America's Got Talent. She's hooked on it. Okay? She watches it. There are all kinds of strange and weird people doing all kinds of insane things. And a lot of it has to do with risk. Now, there's singers and there's dancers, but then there are also the crazy people, okay? You know, the guys throwing knives at their wives. You know, and then there's the people eating fire. There are people juggling chainsaws, you know. There was one girl last week that got in a coffin with a bunch of dynamite and blew herself up. Yeah, I know. That's actually on TV, I know, and we actually have to watch that. So, anyway. But there are people taking risks. And we like to watch it, you know. We like to watch it and we say, look at that, isn't that cool? They're willing to do that, but then we don't do that. We don't like to do anything like that. We like our bubble-wrapped existence that we live. And we like it that way, especially in our Christian life, if you'll think about it. Reinhold Niebuhr, he was a famous theologian of the 19th century, and he tells a parable about this parable. The story of a young man left home. He lived in Kansas. He got on a ship, a big tall masted ship, and he was going to be a sailor, he thought. And he got out there, and one of his first assignments was to climb up to the crow's nest to watch what was going on. Well, he was afraid of heights. So he started climbing his way up that main mast to get up to the crow's nest, when suddenly his fear overcame him and he froze. And he just literally hugged the mast and would not move. He wouldn't go up because he was afraid of heights. He wouldn't shimmy down because he was embarrassed to be found out. And so he took an option that was really no option at all. He just held on for dear life. and that's really what this guy in the parable did. He just clutched that talent with both his hands, and he wouldn't give it up. He wouldn't move. He wouldn't go one way or the other. He wouldn't invest it. He did nothing. He was frozen. He was fossilized. He was paralyzed by his fear. And so that's what happened. He took the option that was really no option, because his master told him to do something quite different, which was to risk it, to put it in business, get me some money, right? And so we need to risk participating in what God is doing rather than just observing. That leads me to the second application, and that is we need to risk doing something for God rather than doing nothing. I mean, if we'd never heard of the parable of talents and its applications, we might be tempted to think that this servant did something commendable. I mean, prudent by doing nothing or by not taking any risks. After all, he didn't lose what he had. I mean, even today, banks go belly up. Banks fail. You remember he said at the end, you could have at least put it in the bank and got interest for me. I mean, you know, $1.4 million. Would you trust $1.4 million to your bank? You might not. Right? I mean, think about it for a second. He didn't lose it. I mean, he had no idea what the prevailing market was going to do, up or down. He didn't want to put it into business. He was afraid of doing that. At least he was honest enough to hand it back to the Lord in the exact amount he was given. We might even expect the Lord would understand, pat him on the head and tell him to trot along. You did fine. You didn't lose it. That's good. But that's not what we get here in this parable by way of assessment and evaluation, is it? Jesus had no sympathy for this man in the parable. None. In fact, some of the most scathing words of judgment come out of Jesus' mouth to describe this man, the one-talent man who wouldn't risk. Look at it. He says, "You wicked and slothful servant." And then in verse 30, he tells him to cast this worthless, unprofitable, useless servant out into the outer darkness. So what did this poor servant do that was so bad? What did he do that was so bad? He failed to take a risk. Right? In obedience to his master. The Lord said to his servant, he said, first of all, you're evil, wicked. Jesus said a refusal to risk for his kingdom is wicked. Now, when we think of evil or wicked, what do we normally think of? We think of some crimson sin, right? I mean, we think of some of those 10 Commandments getting broken in the second set, right? Adultery and murder and stealing and stuff like that. That's usually what we think of. We think of some dramatic moral fall or sinful collapse. In fact, notice here the Greek word that he uses for this guy is paneros. Paneros. It's the same word Jesus used to refer to the devil himself. Wow. Refusing to risk for the kingdom is evil on the level of Satan. That's what Jesus said, not me. So I know you're looking at me funny, but that's what he said. That's pretty serious stuff, isn't it? Well, he doesn't stop there. He calls him also, what else? Lazy. Slothful, I think is the King James, right? It means inactivity. It means inertia. It means idleness. It means an unwillingness to move out and do what God wants us to do. And then to top it off, not only is this riskless disciple called evil and slothful, ultimately he's unnecessary. Look at verse 30. I mean, this is really harsh stuff. The word translated worthless or useless carries with the idea that this man had become a zero when it came to our Lord's assessment of him. He's a zero. He's nothing. Nothing. Null, void, zero. Useless. And all because he was unwilling to risk anything for the sake of the Lord's kingdom. So, since he was unwilling to be a risk taker, as an entrepreneur and an investor, the master said, you're worthless. You're useless. You've become a zero to me. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to hear that on Judgment Day. I don't. I'm going to do whatever I can so I don't hear that, okay? I hope you will. We all need to. Amen? I mean, this church needs to. We play it safe. And that is exactly the way to get the Lord's condemnation at the end of the day. We take a risk, and that's exactly the way to get his commendation at the end. And we see it when he tells these guys what he tells them based on what they did. So, you can almost sympathize with the guy, though. I mean, can't help but sympathizing with him a little bit. I mean, this is a lot of money. This is kind of scary responsibility. You're asking me to be a steward, be responsible over $1.4 million. You can almost hear him, cynically making excuses for why he didn't do it and why these other guys could do it, could take the risks. You can almost see him cynical and snarky and sneering over that 5-talent servant, thinking, sure, he can risk himself. I mean, his father is Rabbi Smellfungus, the dean of the synagogue. I mean, he's got all kind. I mean, he's got a fallback. That dude he's taken care of. The rabbi's going to take his daddy will take care of him. He's going to be good. Or the two-talent servant. If I had his personality and his ability and his looks, I could risk too. He's always able to land on his feet. And so, bitter and cynical, he comes up with this excuse as to why other people can take risks, but he's not able to. And that leads me to this third application, and that is risk accepting responsibility rather than placing blame. What did he do? I mean, when the master confronted him, he didn't do a mea culpa. He said, no, it's you. You, master, you, Lord. You're the problem here. You're a hard man. You reap where you don't sow. Look at what he says here. It's amazing to me. Kind of blows your mind. In Jesus' day, you reap where you haven't sown, you gather where you've not trod. Now, sometimes in Jesus' day, just to explain that for a second, sometimes, when they were sowing a field, some of the seed would go over to the other guy's property. I mean, they didn't have, clear property lines. They didn't have big, tall fences. They didn't have a rock fence everywhere where you had a clear boundary. So sometimes they'd scatter seed, and it would just be indiscriminately out there. Sometimes it'd fall into your neighbor's field, and if you were a grasping kind of person, when you harvested, you might take a little wider swath because you might rationalize, hey, I sowed some seed over there, and I'm going to go ahead and get that grain, right? That's what he's talking about here. But this man's Lord was anything but that sort of guy. And we know that because of the way he treats the other two. He was generous, right? Every time when you read about the Lord, the equation is with God in these parables, we find this crazy, outlandish, outrageous generosity, don't we? Typically. I mean, like when he paid all the guys the same amount. They came to work at 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock was quitting time. This outrageous generosity of the master. And you see that here. I mean, what does the master say to the two guys that did what they were supposed to do? They get some really nice words, don't they? And they get rewarded, too, on top of it. Enter the joy of your, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter the joy of your Lord. You've been faithful with a little, I'll make you ruler over much. He was a generous master. But this guy had a completely warped perspective of his Lord, didn't he? And that's what happens, I think, a lot of times. When we try to play it safe, when we try the lame, same, and tame game, and we don't take any risks for the kingdom. Risk is just another way of saying walking by faith, if you want to go biblical. That's all this is. When we're talking about walking by faith, that's what taking a risk means, okay? When we walk a life of faith, we have the right perspective of God. When we're not walking that life of faith, and we're not taking any risk, and we are playing it safe, and we are keeping everything close, we get this warped perspective of God sometimes. And have you ever noticed that? When you're a spectator, when you're an observer, when you're just a bench warmer and you're just watching everything go on and you're not really doing anything, you can get this warped perspective of God because your Christian life seems to you as boring, it seems same, it seems, bland, and you blame God for that. But guess what? It's not His fault. It's not His fault. Could it be that there's something in me that's not where it needs to be when it comes to my relationship with the Lord? Could it be I'm not taking any risks? Have you ever noticed yourself griping or grumbling about what God is doing in the world or the state of your own Christian life? Well, could it be that you become a watcher, a spectator, an observer, rather than actively and eagerly throwing yourself into and being all in the work of the kingdom? I'm telling you, people... Sometimes when I was in, a pastor for 20 years, people would come to me and they would be complaining about this and that and the other. And I said, you know what would change your attitude completely? Tell me, please, because I need out of this funk. Go serve somebody else.